Welcome back. Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana announced that the budget will include funding to support security and peacekeeping efforts. 9.4 billion rand will be allocated for the Defence Force and correctional services. An additional 5 billion rand will go to the South African National Defence Force to assist in the SADC mission in the Democratic Republic of Congo and other peacekeeping activities. However, SADC has ended its mission in the DRC after an extraordinary summit of heads of state. Troops from South Africa, Malawi and Tanzania will start withdrawing after recent attacks by M23 rebels. How should the budget be adjusted now? Defence analyst Ricardo Teixeira joins us for more insights. A very good evening to you, Ricardo. Thanks for coming into studio. I guess let's start with that first question. How should the budget be readjusted, considering that our troops are now going to be withdrawn?
So the first thing I'd like to highlight is that there's 9.4 allocated for the defence sector, but only 5 billion is for the Defence Force over the medium term. So that's not funding that will be available this year. A small amount of about 1.8 billion is allocated for this year, but given that the mission will be withdrawn, it's likely that this year's allocation will be used to cover the withdrawal of troops and the associated expenses, and what remains of it will likely be withdrawn faster than the mission is being withdrawn.
So basically, it's not going to be enough?
No, it's not going to be enough. Inflation in 2024 was 4.6%. The budget didn't even increase by that. So in effect, there hasn't been a real increase in the budget at all. It's also important to note that the Defence Force has been underfunded to the tune of 65%. They simply just do not have the funds required for what is asked of them. If you look at what the police budget was for 2024 to secure and fight crime in the country, it was 113 billion rand. The Defence Force got less than half of that.
Sure, that puts it into perspective. So how much does it actually cost to run the military? What would have been an ideal figure? So
the 2015 Defence Review, which itself is outdated. I mean, this is a Defence Review that is supposed to be the guiding document for the Defence Force, but it had no funding plans associated with it. And it was written before Russia invaded Crimea, before the rise of ISIS, and all the issues that the world is currently facing. So a lot of the things in there need to be reassessed, but that Defence Review called for a budget allocation of 1.5% of GDP, which is also what the Deputy Minister of Defence noted is in discussion with National Treasury. He announced it last week at the PPP conference at CSIR. So 1.5% of GDP is a good starting point. I don't see a possibility of it being jumped there straight away, but rather a incremental increase until we reach that target. If you wanted to start turning things around, a good place to start, which I have mentioned and to the SCOPA chairperson and several members of the Joint Standing Committee, and the idea of a cash injection, a little bit of a bailout. I think SANDF is currently the only government department that truly deserves a little bit of a bailout to clear the maintenance backlog on equipment and to get things operable again.
Ricardo, when we're looking at just what's happening around the world, the geopolitical tensions and seeing a rise in military aid as well, and more countries, first world countries though, like the US and the United Kingdom, opting to pump more into their defense force, is this not a sign that we are heading into a volatile period where countries need to be able to defend themselves should anything happen? The threat seems a little bit higher right now for some reason.
Absolutely. We are currently sitting on the precipice of the largest arms build-up since the 1930s. China's projected to be invading Taiwan at some point past 2027. They've been building barges. Some of the barges were seen being tested on the shores of this past week in China. The US is trying to shift away from Europe towards the Pacific and prepare for a larger conflict there. We live in a very precarious world. There's a lot of threats rising, and I think a lot of people look at South Africa and go, oh, but your neighbors aren't that threat, and you live outside of ballistic missile range. But we forget that nuclear submarines can be anywhere, and that global conflict has a way of finding its way here. I mean, in October 1943, in that month alone, the Germans sunk 19 ships off of Cape Town. We had Japanese and Italian submarines operating off of Durban during World War II. I think people have forgotten how close conflict can get here, and especially if we live in a world where the Suez Canal is closed off and shipping has to come around the Horn and the Cape and to the southern routes around the continent, the old traditional routes. That puts us as the next choke point at Simonstown, and the Chinese are putting a lot of interest into Simonstown, as previously been in the news. So I think people have forgotten and are naive to how close conflict can get, and the government needs to prepare accordingly. But I want to stress that this is something that can't be changed in a year. This is something that is going to take at least a decade to do. You can't build the defence force overnight. There's no, second-hand submarine lots. You can't just walk into a defence contractor and walk out with a fighter jet. These are things that take time to build. These are capabilities that require long-term investments and foresight.
So, I mean, speaking of that as well, of also capacitating it, the SANDF, we heard in earlier reports as well saying they're going to go on this massive drive to try and employ more people, but specifically younger people, with the average soldier there being, I think, around 49 years old, and they're needing more younger people. How, over 3 years that is, how difficult will that be for an SANDF that's already facing a constrained budget? And also, I mean, we've just seen 14 SANDF soldiers perish in the DRC, so it's going to be very difficult to convince young people, especially, to go and put their lives on the line.
I think it's going to be a bit easier to get those people in. If we look at the applications to the MSDS intake last year, it was over 160,000 applicants for what was less than 6,000 positions. So there's no shortage of applicants. I think the bigger task is going to be finding the right people, because you want someone that can handle the stress. You want someone that understands what they are signing up for. And we also want thinking soldiers. Not everybody can be a soldier. There are stringent requirements around it in terms of fitness and your school qualifications. But we also need a new generation of engineers. We need a new generation of officers. We need a new generation of tacticians. And I think the military is going to be hard-pressed to find the right people unless they start taking a look at what their requirements are and planning ahead. I mean, the chief of the armed forces, or the chief of the army, wrote a book called Planning is Everything, and I think that they need to listen to that idea and start planning ahead, because there is a distinct lack of foresight and strategic planning in the Defence Force at the moment.
And where does that leave us as citizens when there's this distinct lack of foresight, to use your words?
We are not ready for the possibility of a large-scale conflict on the African continent. We are not ready for the world we face, and I think the government, the Department of Defense always likes to say that their goal is to silence the guns, but so far the only ones that have gone silent are our own.
Sure. That's scary. In that announcement as well by the Finance Minister, the total that was allocated was 60.8 billion rand for defence and state security. But then we saw that just a little over, it's 9.4 billion rand that went to defence. And I'm assuming that the rest of that 60.8 billion rand then goes to state security. Explain to me the kind of rationale there, and would you say that we can reconcile that decision and it makes sense?
Look, ultimately, our the Defence Force requires a proper budget, and I mean 9 billion extra would be a great starting point, but it's not going to be sufficient. I think if you wanted to start turning things around, you need around 36 billion over 3 years, broken up amongst the different branches of the armed forces to start clearing the backlog. I mean, the Roy Falk program to get the airframes flying again is going to cost you around 1.5 billion. To recover the Oryx fleet and to get them operable for just a period of 5 years, it's going to cost you 2.5 billion. To get the submarines and the frigates refit and modernized and back into the sea, which is not going to take a year, but it's going to take around 10.5 billion rand. These are things that are incredibly expensive and require long-term investment. But there also needs to be an investment into our intelligence gathering capabilities. We need to be able to see the threats that are coming our way. We need to be able to sense them so that we can act timely and appropriately. And again, there needs to be a commitment of funding over the long term. If we look at France doesn't pass an annual budget. They pass a budget for a 5-year period, and every 5 years they do a review and they align with what their current threats are and how they're going to spend that budget and what their priorities are. We need to start looking at models like that, because the current model is unsustainable.
Okay. And just finally, Ricardo, when it comes to that 60.8 billion rand, of course, state security is also important. But do you think it was split fairly or equitably, considering that only 9 billion then goes to defence and then this chunk goes to state security? Does state security need that entire chunk?
It's tough to say. You know, state security has been very close guarded with their budget. It is something where you need a level of security clearance to talk to and to talk on. The State Security Agency has a habit of classifying anything they can because they can classify everything they can. So it's tough to talk about the budgets on the state security side and what they're really up to. We know at the moment that they are going under restructuring and retrenchments, and they also need to revitalize their entire structure. The state capture years have left the State Security Agency completely gutted. So our intelligence capability for domestic and foreign security is another thing that needs to be completely rebuilt.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Really appreciate you coming in to speak to us about this. That's defense analyst Ricardo Teixeira, who has just joined us to share his insights regarding, of course, that budget for the Defence Force and the state security.